Hey guys, let me just check if everything is working. I hope you can hear me now. I think it's kind of self-explanatory what we are trying to do here. There was an interesting podcast. I haven't listened to it yet, which has Balaji Srinivasan with Tanmay Bhat and the SuperteamDAO podcast team. Wanted to listen through that and also like learn along the way what these guys are talking about. Maybe we also have our own notes. So my intention is to also create a Twitter thread based upon what that podcast was about and learnings and everything. As you can see, I already have set it up. So we'll have the video playing here, and then this is the Typefully app where I write my Twitter threads. So let's just jump into it without wasting any time.
All right, welcome to the Super Team podcast. Today is a very special day. We are recording podcast in broad daylight. That must tell you that this podcast is going to be enlightening. Akshay, who's our guest today?
It's well beyond Tanmay's waking hours. So today's guest is Balaji Srinivasan. We're very excited for this episode. He's a friend of the pod, former CTO of Coinbase, former general partner of Andreessen Horowitz, or as like Tanmay, you like to say, A16G.
A16G. Just a joke. It's just a joke. Chris Dixon follows me. I don't want to mess around.
And an exciting array of topics that to cover today.
And this episode is really important for a bunch of reasons. One, it's Balaji Srinivasan. Okay, it's the main one. Okay, so you guys the retention on this better be crazy high. If you're not sitting with, your significant other or your loved one on New Year's Eve and watching this, you're doing it wrong. Second, the ideas that Balaji talks about in this episode is stuff that Akshay and me have often discussed. It's a lot of stuff that we believe in. It's a lot of stuff that coincides with the missions of the DAO. So that's why it's also really important to us personally. For example, one of the ideas that Balaji speaks in the episode is about India being a media superpower, which is something that I believed in, but I never actually felt it until, we started working with global projects and I realized that, my marketing thoughts and content translates internationally as well. Of course, we have a lot of developers around, but what people don't realize is the potential for Indian talent to make media at a global stage, right?
Yeah, I mean, just like, you have computer code that scripts how computers behave. You have media that scripts how humans behave. And, if we can ship global products from India, as we have seen with SaaS companies and now with crypto startups, there's no reason why you can't ship global media from India.
So in this episode, we have a bunch of tasks, all right? Everybody who's watching this, we are looking for a certain type of people who can watch this episode, grasp the ideas, and turn it into content. Okay. For example, we are looking for folks who can create video memes about the ideas in this episode. Ideally video memes if you can create memes. Otherwise, that's fine too. Just submit your memes. We are also looking for people who can do visual effects, all right? Visual effects, motion graphics, infographics that can show up beautifully. We want these folks in the DAO. So if you can create motion graphics, then look at this episode, look at the themes in this episode, the ideas in this episode, make a video with some beautiful motion graphics, and then apply, and the best ones will get into the DAO and also get a cash prize. We're looking for folks who are graphic designers, illustrators. So if you can look at this episode and see themes in this episode, turn them into illustrations, turn them into a poster, any sort of graphic design, that would be great, and apply with the link in the description. The best ones get to the DAO, and of course they get a cash prize. And of course we're looking for writers, Akshay, folks who can summarize this podcast, in a beautiful way through a Twitter thread, or pick up an idea from this podcast. And there are many ideas, by the way, and write an essay about it, tweet to us, or apply via the form.
Great, that's what we are trying to do.
You too are required in the DAO. All the folks who get into the DAO, there'll be opportunities to work at a global stage with global marketing companies, earn in a global currency. And I'm personally looking at building a marketing team within the DAO for both Indian companies and global companies as well. So it's an opportunity to work with both me and Akshay in the DAO. So if you can, do apply and, just spend some time on it. I hope it'll be worth it for you to watch the full episode. On that note, Akshay, That's it. Let's just get into it.
Let's do it. Hi, Tanmay.
Hi, Akshay. Hi, Balaji.
Great to be here.
Awesome. So Balaji, for those of you who don't know, is an angel investor and entrepreneur. Formerly, he was the CTO of Coinbase and a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz. He was also the co-founder of Earn.com, which was acquired by Coinbase, which is how he eventually became CTO there. And then, in a plot twist, he moved from California to Asia. Sometime after the COVID-19 situation, committed to basically living in between Singapore and India. And with that introduction, we can get straight into why he decided to do that and talk more about his optimism for India, crypto, tech in the region, and all things media. Welcome, Balaji.
Great. Yeah, sure. So, so I did, tweet and blog that I had moved to Asia. And, the thing is, actually, this is something I've been wanting to do for a long time. And even before COVID, the majority of world GDP was in Asia. And so it's not like Asia is the future. It's already the present. Asia still has, you just take India and China have 10x to go. Now, obviously, the world economic environment's changing. China is in a much more bellicose position than they have been historically. But India is also developing rapidly. And I think this is where a lot of the action is. And so, you asked, why did I, make this move? So, I mentioned some of these things in that post. First was just the pull of the growth and the GDP. Second is, I think, in terms of just the stability of the physical environment, Singapore is awesome. And actually, India has improved dramatically recently. And, the thing is, as I mentioned in my tweet, a few days ago, I'm moderately bullish on India, but extremely bullish on Indians. And
Okay, makes sense.
And what I mean by that is, it's not so much that the state itself that I'm bullish on. It is the rapidly developing talent that is now connected to the global internet, regardless of politics or whatever is happening on a daily basis. These are folks who have become much more sophisticated, having had 5-6 years now plugged into the internet, thanks to being online with Reliance Geo and what have you. And I think that in particular, the mobility of the international Indian and the sort of plasticity and fluidity means that they can, maybe they can do things at home. And if they can't, they can also pack up a suitcase and emigrate and try and do things from Dubai or from, someplace in Europe or wherever. And so I'm actually very bullish on that, and I'm bullish on Asia more broadly.
We are negotiating from a position of weakness when we make an argument for India, right? And the reason for that is Tanmay and I are Indians, so it can be conflated with kind of just this chest-thumping nationalism. And of course, we're also Indians, so it would be natural for us to make a case for India. And you're Indian.
Also, as a comedian, like Indian is usually an adjective to leap off into a joke, right? Like, oh, this is so. So when I hear you're very, very bullish on Indians, but moderately bullish on India, can you expand a little bit more on that? I wanna understand more of what you mean by that.
For example, when people say they're bullish on China, a large part of that means they're bullish on the Chinese state. Now, today that's changed. Because it's hard to invest in China. BlackRock is still doing it. But really a big part of when you think of, modern China, for example, is the infrastructure build out, the surveillance state, the military. Certainly the entrepreneurs, especially the tech entrepreneurs, are not state controlled on the way up. When they get to the top, they're state controlled, and WeChat, and it plugs into all the infra and so on, right? So with India, though, I think while there's absolutely some great things happening like India Stack and Reliance Geo in terms of getting connectivity, there the bet is a little different, which is it's more that Indians have actually been like the initial wave, the 5 million or so that is come out of India and landed in the US, the UK, Canada, Australia has done quite well. And then the question is how many more can perform at that world-class level within India? And I think there's potentially quite a lot. We don't know. In a decentralized world, the diaspora with the networking back to India itself, India is like sort of a base where you might go and be there for a year or two in between your next assignment abroad somewhere else. If you think of it like that, right? In some ways like Israel, right? Where you have folks, you have diaspora who will be in Israel and come back, and maybe they will decide to spend some time in Argentina or in France. Like Israelis will have multiple passports typically. That kind of thing I think is going to become more and more common. And it's also in particular because with the Chinese diaspora, they're going to be running into problems given how assertive and hostile in some ways the Chinese state has been. So the reason is, the Chinese diaspora is also huge. It's global. But things like the Meng Wanzhou case, for example, in Canada, where that's a Huawei CFO. She was detained in Canada. And the Chinese in return basically took two people hostage in China, two Canadians. And the reason is they felt that was a political detention. They didn't think that was an actual crime that she had done. So for violating that U.S. sanction, she was detained in Canada for violating an American law as a Chinese citizen, right? So things start to get gnarly there, and so the Chinese diaspora is starting to get interfered with overseas. So they may only want to post up in those countries where they have hard power, whereas the Indian diaspora I don't think will have that problem. And China doesn't really take India that seriously. So it's not going to try to, I think, impede Indian migration, and I don't think the West will either. So India may be one of the kind of dark horses in terms of its global mobility. And the reason, by the way, why do I kind of stress the migration so heavily? It's the ability to migrate, as I just mentioned, the geopolitics of it, where Chinese citizens may start to get more restricted, are already getting more restricted in some ways. For example, a lot of F1 visas for Chinese nationals were denied to the US, and also maybe not wanting to move for various reasons. Indian citizens won't be, but Indians also have the willingness to move if necessary, whether to pack up and live in the Gulf or, be a peripatetic, student in the US. There's like a greater willingness to kind of go and do that. Why is that important? Well, lots of technologies, lots of things, if you're a founder in today's world, will require you to move to the jurisdiction where that is legal, whether it's Wyoming with its DAO laws, whether it's El Salvador with its Bitcoin laws, whether it is a country like, for example, Singapore had a self-driving car zone, the UK is a fintech regulatory sandbox, and so on and so forth, right? Essentially, all the physical world technologies that are being held back for generations by the American regulatory state, starting roughly in the 70s or the 30s, depending on how far back you go, that whole kind of, ice plate is cracking now, and you're having countries differentiate. You're having countries do something different than what the U.S. regulatory establishment, has historically wanted, and that gives the opportunity for an ambitious drone entrepreneur or stem cells entrepreneur, Bitcoin entrepreneur, or DAO entrepreneur to go and move and do something in that jurisdiction. But they have to have the willingness to do that and to live, however far away from their family, and to do that on the drop of a hat. And there's actually a fair number of Indians who are willing to do that. It is more the sort of combination of home base plus abroad plus past success plus future compounding where I'm rationally optimistic.
Like you seem to suggest that network of diaspora will be, and you seem to say that in the same sentence while you use the American state or the Chinese state.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
That's surprising to a lot of people, because why would a network of diaspora be as used in the same sentence as peers to the American state? Could you maybe explain that? And
sure. So, one of the things that made the U.S. great historically was that it wasn't just a nation of immigrants, IMMIGRANTS. It was a nation of immigrants. Within the U.S., the discussion is focused on this misty-eyed thing of people arriving at Ellis Island. But there's another side of the story, which is they left something. They left something, and why they leave? well, it was political instability, or it was communism in China and Vietnam, and poverty or lack of opportunity in India. There's different reasons, but there's something wrong with their home base, and that's why they left. And they're actually willing to go and make that change. And I think that aspect, that migration aspect, it didn't mean that they were disloyal to the home country. It meant that they just couldn't change the local environment, and so they're like, okay, as one person, what I can do, I can't necessarily affect that much change via voting with my ballot. I may have voted in a certain way, but what I can do is I can vote with my feet and with my wallet and move to another jurisdiction where what I want to do is legal, right? That might be as simple as, just working as a doctor in a more sophisticated facility, but it might be as, more complex as founding a company on a technology that is not legal or highly regulated in your home jurisdiction, and now it's like a more free environment in the one that you move to. The thing is that because of the global internet, even when you move, you still often have access to that global market, because it's legal in that country.
This is already happening.
Yeah. It depends on what kind of regulation it is. I mean, if you think about what a regulation is, a regulation makes something that was previously discretionary, either mandatory or forbidden. Think of a speed limit, right? You could drive any speed, but then you have a boundary at 40 miles per hour and then 55 miles per hour, so you're within a constraint, right? And every such law like this imposes constraints like this. And so we live within a hypercube of permissible space. Okay. And the thing is that people don't even realize what's outside of that, because it's like this mental box that one lives in. And you don't just live in it, everybody else lives in it. So you don't see what would happen if 1,000 other people or 1 million other people lived outside that box. Often you can't see it. It's not just invisible boundary. It is like a hard boundary, because you can't see what would happen if that was legalized. One example is with the internet itself. You guys know what the NSF AUP was? Mm-hmm. So the NSF acceptable use policy in 1990, 1991 was repealed. That acceptable use policy prevented commercial traffic on the internet. Why? Because the internet grew up as an academic and military network. And the thought was that if there was commercial traffic on the internet, there would be spam and malware and porn and Tanmay show, and they're all right.
All
they're
equally
absolutely
damaging.
Right. Yeah, exactly. These colossal disasters for the human race happen. But no. It was fine, because you had all that, but you also had Google and Apple, and of course I like Tanmay show. I like your show. So basically, the internet today is now synonymous with .com. But it wasn't always so. At the time in 1990, 1991, who'd have said the NSF AUP repeal will contribute to $10 trillion and 10 hours a day for billions of people in 30 years? That would have seemed like insane. You're within this cube over here. This one little policy shift gets you over here to this totally different dimension of regulatory space. Nobody would have believed that. Similarly, in 2009, what the world needs is a decentralized digital currency that's peer-to-peer with custodial assets. Like, this seemed way too complicated and weird, right? So the thing is, though, that in order to avail yourself of this increasingly decentralized world, and by the way, this is within the U.S. as well as outside. So within the U.S., you have states that are differing on gun laws, abortion laws, immigration laws, but now also, more interestingly, in my view, on fintech regulations, on DAOs. You're starting to get some really interesting things. And when you have diversity of different regulations, if you're interested in innovating in the physical world, if you're interested in biomedicine, if you're interested in nuclear power, if you're interested in aviation like drones or supersonic aircraft. So we know you'll always see these studies that say something like so-and-so scientists discover ocular implant cures blindness, right? Or restores hearing. And, I wrote up some of these in an article called The Purpose of Technology, last year, which you can go and look at. And the question is, if this stuff is so awesome, why isn't it deployed? It's not deployed because of regulations. That's the single biggest usually. And it's often impermissible to that. For example, why can't you just hold up your phone and do medical imaging on any part of your body that you want? In theory, what you could do is hold it up, and if your eyes are red, it could diagnose whether somebody has conjunctivitis or something like that, right? The reason is that while AI is certainly capable of doing that, medical diagnostic imaging is in many benchmarks already before being deployed better than 90 something percent of doctors. It's not better than 100% of doctors all the time, even if it's much cheaper and much faster by orders of magnitude. And so this sort of medical lobby will try to stop that from happening and say, oh, we need a human in the loop. We can't automate this. Oh, the very best doctors will always be better than an algorithm, you silly tech bro. Fundamentally, by the way, this is the only way to truly crash healthcare costs. You have to take the human out of the loop. Okay, so why aren't you doing it? Because of regulations. Why do those regulations exist? Okay, well, because every 9/11 leads to a TSA. Okay, so there's always some crisis that caused an expansion of power of the regulatory state, right? Okay, there's now restrictions. You're now within this box, you can no longer innovate in a way that you could. Why? Going further, well, society in some sense has agreed to those regulations. And the reason I say in some sense is that, it's not like you voted in the US for the head of the FDA. And in particular, most of the employees at, let's say, the FDA, in the US, they have career tenure. Okay, so that's say depending on the exact mechanics of it. After a few years of service, you basically can't be fired. There's something called the Douglas factors, which are like the Miranda rights for federal employees, and most of them will knock down a penalty. Like you try to fire somebody, okay, it gets knocked down to 90-day suspension. Okay, so that means these government employees cannot be fired, and they weren't elected either. You didn't vote for them. Okay, so that's interesting, where you have this group of U.S. government employees who are not elected and can't be fired, therefore are, under either democratic or capitalist theories of accountability, they're immune to both. Just like many small countries have outsourced like many small websites have outsourced their login to Facebook, many small countries have outsourced their regulation to the USA. The most important problem in the world to solve for physical innovation is regulatory harmonization. Have you heard this term before?
No, but I can imagine what it feels like. It's almost like it's a psychological disease, right? I think Jordan Peterson once said, someone asked him saying, why should you have the right to offend me?
It's more than that though. Yes. So this is not, you're thinking they'd all sing in harmony of their own accord. No, it's actually something where the FDA, the SEC, the FAA, these unelected and unfireable and, basically unaccountable bureaucrats in the US government who are just really gray and faceless. You don't know who they are. It's not like Zuck or Musk where you can put a face to it, know who these people are, discount, or, these folks you've never met who are not elected, who can't be fired. They don't just run aviation or drug, policy for the USA. Through harmonization, they intentionally seek to expand their power to the whole world and sign deals with other countries. The reason that companies were quasi okay with this is it meant that once you get your sign off from, the US regulatory agency, the whole world was yours. And the other country would be okay with it because it's like, oh, well, the US is the highest standard in regulation, blah, 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 right? Now, increasingly, that's obviously not the case. Lots of crypto stuff, for example, will just ban Americans right at the beginning. We're seeing the regulatory flippening happen where America is seen as the worst place to do business in some areas as opposed to the best. Okay. There are starting to be significant advantages in certain spaces to not being a US citizen. Now, it's not 100% because there's significant innovation.
We are seeing it right now.
Yeah, you're seeing it right now. That's right. Like whether buying into it, like some of the new crypto stuff or so on. And so basically, the global founder can do things that the American and Chinese cannot. Okay. By process of elimination, that's basically India's number 3, right? So why can't you do drones? Why can't you do medical imaging? Okay, because of this rule, right? Why does this rule exist? Okay, because there's some tragedy and then people agreed on it. Who are those people? That's where people don't normally know. They are this unelected group. Okay, well then why can't you do it somewhere else in the world? Well, that unelected group uses harmonization to have like global domination of regulations. And how do we change this? Fifth question. The answer is that as the US is sort of declining rapidly in world power, to an extent that I don't think people understand, right? When there's like a mark to market, something is priced here, but then suddenly it's just step function down. When you go and revalue it, you're like, okay, actually
Tanmay is very familiar with this.
Okay. Yeah. So if you mark something to market, there's some things that are publicly traded and they constantly have a buy and a sell process and they're marked to market every second, something like Bitcoin or what have you. Other things, if you're going between financing rounds, your next raise is when you figure out what the thing is worth, and then people will appraise it that way. And if it's hot, it's up there. And if it's not, it might be a little bit of struggle, right? If you're a country with a problem, for example, not just a company, but like in Argentina, you'll have a markdown. What we're seeing is the U.S. taking significant markdowns in terms of estimates of its state capacity. For example, a very concrete one, November 2019, right before the pandemic, the World Economic Forum, Davos, they estimated that in the event of a pandemic, the U.S. would be number one in terms of pandemic preparedness and China number 78. It's more like the reverse, right?
Yeah.
Right. And the thing is, people are still in denial about this. Okay, they're still in denial. During the pandemic, I saw a very interesting new phenomenon, which is when going from the kind of chest thumping, USA number one, we're always the best, in the movies, the, soldiers saved the world from aliens and stuff like that. Like going for that to, what are you saying? We're not the worst in the world. Like, and then every country or every place you bring up that might be doing better on COVID. New Zealand, well, that's like an island. Oh, China, well, that's like a genocidal authoritarian dictatorship that caused COVID in the first place. So how could you possibly ask that we emulate anything? The reason I keep talking about like the physical world innovation stuff is that once we got the digital world, we could start building, and we are starting to build consensus around changing laws in the physical world. Because all those laws ultimately are the consensus of millions of people, expressed somehow. And if you can build a large enough online community, you can start pressuring for change of law in jurisdictions. Change of law unlocks physical innovation. So the Thielian dichotomy between change of law unlocks physical innovation. So the Thielian dichotomy between innovation in bits and not atoms means we resolve that with innovation in bits, gives us consensus in bits, gives us innovation in atoms. Just to recap, just to pull all those pieces together. A, because India is number 3, it'll have this balancing role. B, Indians are already flexible and international. C, there's already evidence that the diaspora can be successful. And, it's obvious, like Sundar Satya, Kamala Harris. The success of Indians abroad, I think, is actually pretty substantial. You can argue China, for example, plays the world's best home game, but India plays the world's best away game. And I think that's true. There's that, like the movie Super 30. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Yeah. At the beginning, essentially, he's kind of voiceover guy, is, talking about, India is a third world country, but, who's the CEO of Google? Well, you can Google it, right? The thing here is not to be like irrationally optimistic, but to realize, yeah, you can do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? You can, there is no limit to you. Removing that psychological ceiling is pretty important, that Indians can compete at a world-class level. If you look at what Polygon and Matic, or Polygon/Matic have done, Oyo, we have all of these unicorns now. We have all of the success abroad.
I think the more Polygons and Matics and Sundar Pichais and Oyos, that actually makes you feel like, okay, this is possible. And actually, I have seen this in the last 2 years. It's fashionable it's become really cool to have your own startup. It's no longer cool to work. It's no longer cool to have a job. I mean, this has been true for the last decade, but now this is the top, right? Like, it's never been this there.
I mean, the thing about it is, I am a pragmatist, and for a lot of people in India, still coming out of a background of significant poverty, it's fine to go and get that Google job or whatever, right? Like, that's totally, like, for a lot of folks, the extra return or autonomy of a startup is not necessarily worth that risk. Okay. Actually, I have this talk from earlier this year that I think the talk was how India can win-win, right? And the reason I say how India can win-win is, as opposed to the US and China that are just playing to win, you lose, I win, right? Rather than just playing to win, India by its nature cannot play to win. So it has to play to win-win. Both parties win. Okay. So not zero sum, but explicitly positive sum. That is actually, it is frankly a different mindset than both the US and China are in, where they're locked in this kind of, Cold War-ish global competition, right? India, by being forced to play to win-win, that changed the mentality of its citizens and what it can do. And I was basically just talking about areas of strength. For example, one area that I think is very underestimated, and this is like, when I talked about the pseudonymous economy, with the rise of crypto for payments and AI for voice and avatars and so on, it will be possible to completely separate your speaking name and your earning name and your real name and so on, and have multiple identities to go and earn, right? I actually think India, if China was and is a tech and manufacturing superpower, I think India becomes a tech and media superpower. Why do I think India can become a media superpower? Well, several reasons. First is Indians have shown an ability to succeed in media in the West. There's lots of, while I'm not sure it's a credit to India, there's many journalists idiots have become journalists. But there's many authors. There's obviously M. Night Shyamalan in Hollywood, but then many others. There's Aziz Ansari and so on. And then more generally, South Asians have done quite well. But Indians are also actually behind the camera, where a lot of computer graphics, for like Pixar and stuff like that, are often done in India. A lot of animation, hand animation and computer animation is done in India. That's been like a strength of India for a long time.
This has been true for a very long time. I remember we used to stay back in the theater just to see Indian names in the credits, right? During animated movies. It was a thing I used to do with my parents.
That's right. And so here's the thing. Just like the Chinese, swallowed their pride, and they started out making plastic stuff for Walmart and getting basically people bossing them around at their factories and so on. And,
Made in China was a joke, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They just saw just a plastic of Walmart. But you know what? They ascended the value chain, right? They ascended the value chain. They learned from making the plastic stuff, and then they went and did, assembly for iPhones and so on. And now suddenly they're doing, DJI drones and, if you saw that recent thing, hypersonic missiles, and they've got a pretty sophisticated military. And they've got a pretty sophisticated infrastructure, and they're nobody's fool. I mean, there's still areas where they're not number one, but they're focused on getting number one in everything physical, right? And I think that, frankly, Indians can get number one in everything digital. Not just computer science, where I think people now feel that is the case. Media, this decade, India can become a media superpower. And let me explain more concretely what I mean by that. First, I do not mean that Bollywood becomes super popular globally, because that's the obvious thing that people think. What are you saying? Bollywood is going to replace Hollywood? I'm not saying that, but there's a big difference. For example, if you think about a Chinese origin chair, a made in origin chair from China, you may be sitting on one right now. Do you think of it as Chinese? Not really. You think of it as a globally competitive product that was made in China, as distinct from, let's say, dim sum, right, or red envelopes. That's like a Chinese cultural thing. Those are things that are distinctively Chinese. You don't think about those when interacting with the chair. The chair is like a global product, right? So Bollywood or laddus or something, that's like distinctively Indian. An interesting question is, what is the global product that just happens to be made in India? Okay. And what does that look like, for example, in media? Well, it may look like VR movies. It may look like video games. It may look like content that analyzes the whole world. It is no longer. It's memes. Yeah, exactly. It's NFTs, right? The thing is that one of the reasons Indians are particularly successful in software is there's a new industry which didn't have existing hierarchies, of the old, right? And they've become successful in politics and media and whatnot, but particularly so in software because it's all leveled out with a keyboard. It's all being leveled out, and anything you want to do, you can do with a keyboard. Media. Okay? Like, basically, you used to need I mean, we still take this for granted because I think it's still a traveling wave which hasn't fully hit, right? But you used to need Hollywood for distribution. I mean,
Correct.
Here's one way to kind of level set. 30 years ago, you ever heard of the Unabomber? So I think late 80s, early 90s, he sent a bunch of bombs to universities and other places. His goal was to get a manifesto published in, I think, the Washington Post and other places. And you can read that manifesto or what have you online. And he killed for the distribution. Okay.
Wow.
If you think about that, 30 years ago, distribution was so scarce, the Unabomber would literally go and kill people for an op-ed in the Post. The thing about that is that's within human lifespan. You know, I remember that time, but that helps calibrate how scarce it was. You know, the hammerlock of relatively few people, like, oh my God, you're on TV? Wow. Right? Like that was like this huge deal to be on TV at some point. It was like a very small group of people who controlled mass media. You know, it was like a few tens of thousands of people and then, you know, a few dozen folks who run the major studios and could greenlight things. And so they're just choke points of mass media because you needed a TV license or you needed, you know, to own a movie studio or you need a radio license or some of these choke points. And what the internet did is it basically repealed all of that. It's all zeroed out. You don't need a TV license to broadcast on YouTube. You don't need a radio license to set up on SoundCloud. You don't need to be the post office to send an email. It effectively, quote, legal, you know, I don't usually use the term deregulate because it sounds negative. It legalized or decriminalized the process of doing radio without a license or whatever, okay? We take that for granted, but that was a really, really big deal. Remember, again, going back to my theme about we're in this invisible box and we can't see what is outside it until, you know, because the benefit isn't immediate. You need to allow people to kind of, oh, you know, they look into blinking into the daylight and then they start actually migrating towards this new point in.
Oh yeah, I'm a product of this deregulation.
Yes.
Yeah.
As I said, you're one of the doubts. No, I'm just kidding.
No, one of the things I have
your show is actually really large and really good. And actually, I think it is a good sort of transitional element where it shows how competitive India can be. In fact, I'm not sure if it was Kunal Shah or somebody else who pointed out that there all these tech companies do this arbitrage where they pile up the users in India and the money in the rest of the world, right? And that combination looks good.
India's a DAO country, right? Not an ARPU country. That's why I think that's what Kunal keeps talking about.
That's right. But I think that you don't actually want it to be an ARPU country necessarily because that's a country of consumers. I think what India could level up in dramatically is as a country of producers of the back end for digital tasks. So digital outsourcing via crypto, a lot of the DAOs, a lot of those tasks are very well suited for lots of Indians doing on their phone. DAOs are very underrated in terms of, you know, having lots of Indians on their phones doing things. You're still going to have to coordinate, you know, you're still going to have, you know, both algorithms and humans curate the work product coming up, but lots of things can be potentially converted into digital assembly line like things.
Actually, we're seeing that right now with the SuperteamDAO, right, Akshay? I think Indian talent just needs to recalibrate what content they make about what content that can help them actually capture some value of what they do as opposed to making content for themselves, which is what most of them are doing. A lot of them are chasing likes, but they should be chasing crypto.
Yeah. Well, so what's interesting is you can put them together where you go from internet influencer to crypto creator. The difference being as a crypto creator, you have property rights on your content. You know, you have the private keys. Basically, if you don't own the private keys, you don't really own your social media account. You essentially have conditional access to something which you could get deplatformed from. You know, with Trump getting deplatformed from Twitter, whatever else you think about that, future historians will look at that as a moment where, quote, the most powerful man in the world wasn't even the most powerful man in his own country. So it shows that like the world is sort of destabilized right now in a way that we don't fully understand. It's kind of like it's in a transitional state where it still has the form of the old, but not yet the form of the new. But second, to the specific point, it shows that your account is not yours. And all these, you know, account takedowns, I mean, again, even like outside of Twitter or politics, like, you know, the YouTube demonetization, it's just like this blue nose censorship-y kind of thing, right? So to truly be a creator, you have to be a crypto creator, not an internet influencer. In fact, the gap between them is the gap of digital property rights. And that gap is so big, It's like the gap of China before capitalism and after capitalism, because the big thing was that in China before capitalism, you didn't even own the teeth in your head, right? Under like truly orthodox Maoism, people were just executed for entrepreneurship. And, it's a whole story where there's, farmers who went and capitalism was so taboo that they signed a contract basically saying, okay, look, what if we each keep some of the grain that we have? We don't have like 100%, going over to the government. We can keep like 30% of it. And, if we're killed for signing this contract, because contracts themselves are illegal, then we're supposed to take care of our children or something. We each round robin. Okay. This contract they signed in a village and they shoved it into like the roof of a hut. And what happened, of course, is once they could actually keep some of what they had done, production massively increased to such an extent, of course, that the communist guards came in and were going to execute everybody. And seriously, right? Like that's what China was in the mid 70s. Fortunately, at that point, Deng Xiaoping had taken over China. So he's like, actually, no, let's not do that. Let's allow the reform and opening up process. Okay. And let's do more of this. Okay. And the point is that, of course, unlocked this massive amount of production, being able to keep some of it. That is the level of unlock, because we're really talking about billions of people on social media. There's 3 billion people on Facebook. Nobody controls any digital property rights. It's not just your tweets, by the way, or your posts. It is your relationship to your users. It is your ability to monetize the content without YouTube just turning it off, without them intermediating and taking a big cut of the revenue. It's like, why should this gigantic corporation just be able to seize this stuff at will? That doesn't really fit either, groups, whether silence you at will or seize it at will. It doesn't start to feel like a good deal anymore. I mean, in the early 2000s, it was a great deal for Facebook and YouTube and so on to give you this free global distribution because, wow, I can reach anybody in the world and it's for free and they give me a UX and I can upload stuff and monitor and look at the analytics. That was an enormous step over the 1990s when people, as I mentioned, with the Unabomber were killing for distribution. So they were at one point a huge step. But now times have changed and, the economic terms of the agreement are changing because people are realizing they're not getting a cut, they're not having control. Okay, so putting the pieces together. India becomes a media superpower means just like China makes a global chair that's not Chinese, Indians start to make global content that's not recognizably Indian. It could be done in an Indian accent, that's fine. But if it's pseudonymous, you don't even see that part. You're watching a cartoon or a YouTube channel where it's all computer generated but it's made in India. Nobody knows that. Okay. You're reading an article. It's not read in an accent, but it's just on drones or something like that. And maybe in the very fine print. It's not that you're not proud of it, but you're not front paging it. It's not the reason people are buying it any more that the reason that they're buying this tomato is because it was made in a particular place. India becomes a media superpower is also true for another reason, which is America is declining as a media superpower. Okay, most people don't fully understand this, but Hollywood sucks now in many ways. Like if you go and look at the recent movies and so on, it's not just the sequels and the reruns. That's been happening for a long time. Like the lack of creativity. I mean, how many Batman movies can you possibly make? It's just literally the same stuff over
I start
and
my
over
drinks
again.
from a Netflix cup.
Yeah, exactly. But
actually, on Netflix, the top shows are all global now. Like Squid Game is a great example, right?
yes, that is new, right? That is global stuff influencing an American and other audience. America is starting to become acted upon from a media perspective rather than just a media exporter. It's also something where, if you look at Teen Vogue or Sports Illustrated, all of these publications have all gone woke in a particular way, which is they sound indistinguishable from like BuzzFeed and Vice, which itself sounds indistinguishable from, Sulzberger's paper, the New York Times Company. By the way, it's always very important to not call it or think of it as, quote, the New York Times. It is owned by this guy, Arthur G. Sulzberger, who inherited it from his father's 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 father.
His Substack, basically.
Yeah, it's his Substack, right? Like the reason I say that is
Arthur Sulzberger Substack. Actually,
Yeah,
that's maybe what we
exactly.
start calling it. All right.
yeah, exactly. The reason about this, by the way, just to digress on that for a second, these American media outlets have, that scene from The Matrix where you have there's the chip in the back of the neck and it's like pulled out in front, right? These American media outlets, New York Times Company, several years ago, literally ran billboards declaring itself the truth. Okay.
Yeah.
Fox News also declares itself fair and balanced. The Washington Post says democracy dies in darkness. So these American media corporations are so ballsy that they equate themselves literally with truth, fairness, and democracy, and yet, so it's like the most ridiculously rapacious, insane, arrogant corporations. They're the caricature of the corporations that they attack on a daily basis. For example, they'll attack a corporation for not being meritocratic when they're literally run by white nepotists. They will attack a corporation for having dual class stock when they've been closely owned businesses with dual class stock for generations, and so on and so on. It's like this Freudian concept of projection. They are what they purport to hate, right? This is actually a fragile situation, in a world, a fragile what they and so on. It's like this Freudian concept of projection. They are what they purport to hate, right? This is actually a fragile situation, in a world context. It's not just the U.S. dollar that I think is weak to Bitcoin. It's not just the U.S. military, which is weak relative to China. It is the U.S. media that is weak relative to global media, because all of these outlets now sound the same, literally to the point, by the way, that I'm not sure an AI, if you strip the identifying information, I'm not sure an AI could distinguish between a BuzzFeed article, a Teen Vogue article, a New York Times article. And this is one of the reasons Substack is picking up all of these writers, is because you no longer have an incentive to be with the crowd. In fact, the opposite. You don't have the incentive to do, clickbait. You're trying to actually attract subscribers at least. And the style of writing on Substack is at least making long form argument, right? And it's pulling away the people who are smart from legacy media and leaving only those who just mindlessly repeat stuff. And so Glenn Greenwald and Taibbi and Barry Weiss and Jesse Singal and all these folks have left legacy media to go and be founders. Okay. This is similar to the point that you guys mentioned, which is Indians recently realized, okay, founding is actually a high prestige thing. That's also happened within American media. The best have realized, the highest prestige thing is not to work for an established outlet, but now to found my own at a Substack, which I can build into maybe a Rogan-like enterprise or something over time, right? The reason that's important, just to put all the pieces together, A, India has the opportunity to become a media superpower because, B, India has already been successful abroad. C, they've now become familiarized with social media. D, they speak English, okay? E, the US media is actually declining on the world stage, with global things starting to become popular and acting upon the US. F, the US media actually all sounds like woke at the same time, right? G, and so the niches have been abandoned, by the way. What that means is the Sports Illustrated niche, the Teen Vogue niche, you could just go in and like one Indian guy or somebody anywhere in the world who speaks English, who's now familiar with US culture or any other culture, could just go in and just start doing a Substack or a YouTube that crushes Sports Illustrated or Teen Vogue. And you would win. Like that's the thing. Like the anything you can do with a keyboard and mouse, that's something that like you can kind of now contest, right? You can contest that niche. Also, one of the things is by being on the other side of the globe, you can't be canceled by them, right? It's like, who cares? It's a different, literally a social network, right? And you might, for example, you might come in with a different cut on it. You might not do exactly Sports Illustrated, but you might do, for example, theathletic.com, right? It's a recent startup that kind of went after sports, right? I'm sure basically every niche that all these guys have abandoned to just sing the same woke hymns, right? You can go after those and do them better and do them global.
There's actually a lot of stuff here that we've been thinking about as we're putting together a DAO, which is what are the types of tasks that you can create within the DAO that can showcase Indian talent at a global scale. Product is obviously one, content is the other. In fact, we experimented with this thing where, Tanmay and I are part of this.
Like everything he's
NFB.
saying, it's already happening, right? So Akshay and me are part of a global Discord, right? Nothing to do with India. It's just a Discord with some crypto enthusiasts. So we got some of talent that we know. They're Indian kids spread across the country. They made some content and we posted on the Discord and everyone loved it. They have no idea who we are. They have no idea who made it. And they posted it and a global community appreciated it.
And
was
guess
just a
what?
moment.
We had an Australian guy do a voiceover on it for $30 on that meme video. And so
Yeah.
there was absolutely no footprint or fingerprint of where that video came from geographically.
Yeah.
But it was written by three.
Yeah, it was
Indian
written in
people who-
Mumbai, voiceover done in Australia. It was edited by someone in Madhya Pradesh. Like, it was all over.
Awesome. So Balaji, first we talked about why Indians are on the rise and why being a part of a network of Indians is equivalent to being as powerful as the American state as we enter the 2020s and the 2030s. Is that a fair estimate of what you said in the first part?
Well, so I don't know if you want to contest the U.S. the state level in quite the same way. I'd say that there is an opportunity opening up where people underestimate India, they underestimate Indians. Indians often underestimate themselves. India is not going to be contending for number one, and because of that, can contest a lot of anything that you can contest on a computer, which is a larger number of niches. India can get there.
Contesting America, I mean, you don't have to move to the US anymore. You can stay back at home in your hometown, open up your
That's right.
laptop, download a wallet, and that's effectively like having an H-1B visa and being in the US 30 years ago.
That's right. The
Is
new
that
dorm
right?
room founder is a developing world founder, or what I call the ascending world founder.
That's a good saying.
Room founder is a developing world founder, or what I call the ascending world founder.
Got
Ascending
it.
World Founder sounds better.
How India wins an international technology strategy for the 2020s. So basically, while the US and China are fighting and playing to win, India can play to win-win with the rest of the world. After COVID-19, the US is no longer a model for the world. It used to be that China copied the US and India copied China, right? Developed and developing world. Everyone's copying the US. The US is the most advanced, the model. But this phrasing embeds within it important concepts. Developed world implies things are over, it's done. And developing world, everybody's converging to that. Developed is arrogant and it's kind of also short-sighted because it's actually not in favor of technological progress. It says it's a done deal. It's developed, past tense. All legacy institutions, U.S. institutions failed under COVID with the polarization and the riots and, like the loss in Afghanistan, like all of this stuff together. The U.S. is no longer the model, which is why you're starting to see Europe and others all breaking away from it. Importantly, in the ascending world, the goal is not just to copy the guy ahead of you, right? And not to be just focused on China, but to think about what you can do uniquely. Okay. So India in some ways now leads the US on national software infrastructure because there's nothing quite like India Stack at the national level in the US. Stripe is the closest. That's like a private solution. And that's basically the way that the US does everything now. But the public infra for digital stuff is in some ways actually better in India. Like the internet is cheaper, which is amazing for somebody who's looking at India over 40 years. It's just like improved a lot in those aspects. So technological leapfrogging is one aspect. But I think a related concept is ideological leapfrogging. Because the US is no longer a model, zero that out. Stop thinking about the US as the best. And instead start thinking about what is the best in an absolute way, right? And so I love these images from this kind of recent, music video, Bindis and Bangles. I think the music video itself is only, but the images are really good. It shows kind of a fusion of historical Indian culture with technology. It is a vision of just going straight from developing world to spacefaring transhumanist, leaving the Starbucks sipping wokeness and political polarization and so on in the dust, and just jumping straight to the next stage. If that's possible to do technologically, is it possible to do ideologically? What does next look like? How do we skip past? That's a powerful concept, right? So while the US and China play to win, India can play to win-win with the world, right? So the Thucydides trap, are the US and China headed for war? Maybe. This was actually like, 2015. seems like, this is more and more true. Cold War II is now beginning. America, and China are now in conflict. The number 3, can choose a different path along with number 4 to N. This is like a political example where, people, receive COVID vaccines. Obviously, India had, problems, with COVID, but overall, despite those problems, still on a per capita basis, done significantly better than the US, but not as nowhere near as well as China has, at least in terms of reported stats. The thing about it though is, COVID is just kind of one example. This is a different, at least attempt at diplomacy than the increasingly zero-sum nature of what the US and China are doing. So the number 3, by necessity, has to choose a different path. Because you can't play for world domination, you can work with number 4 through N to do decentralized, demilitarized zones with opportunity for all. So Bitcoin and crypto are super important for the international Indian, for the global Indian. And the global Indian, by the way, does not need to be, it can be a migrant, but it can just be somebody who lives in India with a global mindset, which is now possible because of the internet and because of cryptocurrency.
Well, and so if a million people got the H-1B visa, there's 700 million people that will get the crypto visa.
Exactly. That's right. And so now you are in the global economy. You are basically, you cannot just communicate, but transact as an equal. This is a super important thing where once you were within many Indians, once they were within the American legal system and economic system and had the property rights, they flourished. And one way of thinking about it is that cryptocurrency is better than the American legal and financial system. That is to say, it is an improvement over it. It is more predictable. It has better rule of law. It has better property rights. It has better contract enforcement. And it's now available to everyone.
Hey, pre-mutual learning in the chat. We're listening to this podcast by Balaji, trying to understand some Web3 and crypto stuff for India. Let me know if you have any questions in the chat. I'm making my notes on the side. I will share these these are a lot of notes, but I will refine them, consolidate them, and then tweet it out on a thread so you can see my Twitter handle. The link is in the description.
Everybody, which means that the value proposition of physically emigrating to the US is much, much less than it was. If you factor out physical America and digital America, the physical America value proposition is like getting a hot dog and going to a baseball stadium and walking around and seeing, the Mississippi River. The digital America proposition is basically Uber and Airbnb and Google and Gmail and PayPal. It's all these digital services. But if you factor this out, now the world basically has access to the same services as digital America. Like you travel abroad, whatever country you're in, something like Gmail works, something like Uber works. It might be called Grab, but something like it works. And so the digital America is now like a thing in its own, and that's kind of the valuable part. Physically coming to the US is less and less valuable. You can actually do that from anywhere, including from India. And one way of thinking about this is rebooting the non-aligned movement as a new decentralized movement, which is actually an aligned movement. So in the Cold War, India stayed out of Cold War I. They were in third place, meaning they didn't actually field troops with the Soviet Union. Even if they were sort of Soviet aligned, they didn't actually field troops. But the non-aligned movement became synonymous with the third world. So the first world was the US and its allies. The second world were the communist states, and the third world were, all of these, poor countries, right? The thing is that what's happening in the current order is we're moving from a US-led order, but people do not want it to be a Chinese-led order. Because, China, may have for 35 years, from 1978 to 2013, they were revolutionary communists under Mao. They were internationalist capitalists under Deng, Jiang, and Hu. But under Xi Jinping, they really have become nationalist socialist. They are just kind of this fearsome military kind of thing. And in the absence of a U.S. check on their power, think about how badly behaved the U.S. was after the USSR fell out of the picture. Over time, the U.S. started invading more and more countries, and unchecked power wasn't that good. The Chinese version of unchecked power may not be very good if you're not Chinese. And so people, while we're transitioning away from the US-led hierarchy, people don't want the Chinese-led hierarchy. Instead, what India can advocate for and should advocate for is decentralized networks where everybody's a peer at the table. United Networks as a
not opposed to, but as a successor to the United Nations. And the thing about this is, if these are techno-economic networks where everybody effectively has a stake in those networks, like the Bitcoin network, like the Ethereum network, it's no longer the non-aligned movement, it's the aligned movement because you're economically aligned. Like I'm just saying a few words here, but this is like a vision for a lot of possible things. It's a new way of thinking about global affairs. You're advocating for neutrality that is provable via code versus just assuming that this contract is going to be enforced by this or that judiciary. You're trying to put it into a more neutral zone of code enforced on the internet, right? Okay. So any questions on this?
At the heart of it is decentralization of power to some degree, right? And is it in human nature to be okay with that? Right? Like I just can't get myself to believe that all these countries will be okay with that, right? Like inherently, isn't like a power struggle inevitable? How does that exist in a decentralized world?
So basically everybody thinks, if you ask who should be in charge, the first answer is I should be in charge. The second answer is no one should be in charge. And the third answer is this other guy who I don't like should be in charge, right? So no one should be in charge. It's not as good as you being in charge, but it's way better than your opponent being in charge. So as a not ideal but acceptable result, many people will be okay with decentralization, where it limits their root access to the system, but it also limits the other guy's root access to the system. So you know what? I can live with that. Fine. This, by the way, is why we have society. It is, yeah, okay, I can't beat you up, but you also can't beat me up. Okay, fine, let's trade. And that's that equilibrium. It's funny, but it's true.
That's
right?
what it comes down to, yeah.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to, right? So the thing is that advocating for that is, I kind of put up this tweet the other day. Do you know like Dungeons and Dragons, like lawful good and lawful evil?
Yeah.
So, it's saying one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. So, well, one man's lawful good is another man's lawful evil. And so lawful neutral may actually be the true lawful good. Yeah. Because lawful neutral is seen as good enough by everybody. Because tens of millions of Chinese have an experience with cryptocurrency and they know that it's a neutral technology and they know that it's actually genuinely fair rather than arbitrary, it is a much more realistic ideological competitor to the top-down control of a communist regime than the increasingly dysfunctional, shambolic, like America today, right? America is like a failing state. China is ascending. It's less and less threatened by the U.S. government as a model. It can't, because the U.S. government can't do infrastructure or anything like that. But crypto, as global rule of law and genuine fairness, is actually something that is the true ideological competitor to the Chinese superstate. And I think that's the dynamic of this century. If the 20th century was Soviet communism versus American capitalism, I think this century is Chinese centralization versus digital decentralization. So that's a very deep point, because decentralization is not exactly, it's not like left-right necessarily. It's a fusion of left and right, just as centralization is a fusion of left and right. If you know the political compass, the political compass memes, right? Yeah. It's a different cut on it. It's kind of like authoritarian versus libertarian, is like centralist versus decentralist, but but a lot of axes are rotated relative to the 20th century. So I think that India can become a global champion of decentralization, and I think Indians should advocate for it. And again, don't wait for the state to do it. You should do it as an individual, where if 100 people watching the show go and all set up media operations, whether it's YouTubes or Substacks or whatever, and start advocating for this, it will happen. And if another 100 are going and being the founders who are building these networks, it will be feasible.
So let's just pause there for a second, Balaji. So I guess the key takeaway here is that during the Cold War, India, the non-alignment movement was operating against the headwind of a rising America, and so was not the best strategy that put India as a true ally of America to benefit from the rise of America. However, the non-alignment movement now while by aligning ourselves with the network, we catch the tailwind of the rising network, and there is no headwind. In fact, the tailwind of a rising network and a declining America. So is that a fair assessment of why this time the non-alignment movement is going to work in our favor?
Yes, and let me add a few other things. This time, the non-aligned movement is the aligned movement because economically aligned. Because all these folks will have an interest, a stake in these crypto networks, both at the state level and the citizen level. Number one. That's different, right? Because the non-aligned movement was just a grab bag of folks from different countries. And in the absence of some coordinating mechanism like NATO or the Warsaw Pact, they couldn't really do anything together. And they didn't have power projection capabilities and so on. The internet changes all of that. Rather than having India and Egypt and so on, like their heads of state get in a room, their citizens can collaborate organically via the internet at zero cost on smart contracts and crypto stuff and DAOs and what have you.
Right. And so crypto punks, they may be from, the holders may be from several countries, but they all feel like they're part of the same thing.
Exactly. Right. So unlike the non-aligned movement, there's economic alignment. There's information alignment directly between citizens who can cheaply communicate with each other as opposed to their leaders, trying to organize something. So the next post-war order, it's not going to be based on multilateral institutions, but neutral crypto protocols. The way I think about it is, you have the Chinese TikTok and WeChat, you have the American social networks. So the future is national networks and crypto protocols because US tech corporations can no longer be trusted. Each state gets its own networks plus global crypto protocols. Okay. So, every state, India gets its own social networks. Russia has Yandex, Japan, et cetera, because none of them want like an American or Chinese tech company to be able to hit a button and deplatform them. But that's not enough. They also have the global crypto networks in the middle. You see what I'm saying? You start identifying these as American networks, and that's fine, but you have your own network, and so do the Brazilians, and so does every state that has enough scale, that can make a domestic social network. And then those tap into this global crypto network or set of crypto networks for transactions and communications. And so the critical thing is you don't think of India as trying to be the leader of the free world, but the bootloader of the free world, meaning it's helping to boot this up. So, like a bootloader, it's like the stuff where, the firmware loads up. You've probably seen this on a screen, right? And again, even though I'm putting a flag here, it really is Indians individually. And frankly, lots of Americans will be involved in this, as well as probably some diaspora Chinese people and lots of folks from other countries. But I think India has and Indians, just by virtue of sheer numbers, can play a very important role.
It's amazing, Balaji, that Indian parents are criticized heavily for wanting their kids to study engineering. I guess the happy accident and the upside of this generational emphasis on sending your kids to engineering college from since they're 4 days old is now that we have the nation with the highest number of engineers ever, the fastest growing country by open source contribution, and 1 million engineers passing out every year, which kind of lines up with a world where networks are more important than countries, and those networks are built by engineers and coders as opposed to the statesmen or founding fathers of a country. Just this middle class aspiration of having your kids do engineering ended up in this happy accident where India might be at the forefront of this global decentralization.
Yeah, and the thing about this is also, so obviously I'm super bullish on doing engineering. I actually think Indian parents should get praise for doing that,
So hyper focus on this competency.
Yeah. Listen to them on that one. Okay. But I'd say a few other things.
Tanmay, you and I are in GMI.
Yeah. I mean, well, so one thing about it is India is not, I mean, it's doing way better than I thought it was, but it's nowhere near competitive with China on physical manufacturing. But if you think about what's next, but what's next, just being good at software may be sufficient by 2050 or so. And the reason is all kinds of physical production will get automated via robotics. Everything in the physical world becomes like, the concept of a printer, right? You hit a button and an electromechanical process begins where clank, clank, and a physical paper is printed out with some markings on it, right? Generalizing the concept of printing, when you hit enter and today, like a Grab or Uber Eats delivery person comes to your door, every aspect of that can be turned into robotics, from growing the food on the farm to loading it in the truck to a delivery robot coming to your door. And you can eventually think of that as like printing, like an electromechanical actuation process, just one that's more sophisticated than a few wheels, turning on your table, but rather a bunch of robots acting in synchrony. All labor can become capital. When that happens, being really good at engineering, that just gets higher and higher and higher leverage. What I just described, that robotic world, is not just a world of like food delivery, but it's a world of, like warfare. It is, with drones, it is agriculture, it is manufacturing. So just being really good at software is going to keep having compounding returns. And so that's important. But the other thing is, if quote technical outsourcing, so to speak, has been around for a while, and now it's not just outsourcing. Of course, Indians are founding their own things. They're actually the ones who are giving, folks jobs around the world. It's not just technical outsourcing. It's verbal outsourcing that is about to happen, because all of this, as I mentioned, American media has just declined, plummeted. Everybody's just saying the same dumb woke stuff, and all these niches have opened up, and Indians don't have baggage. And if you make a global product, not something that is, Bollywood and yoga, like that's all fine. Look, nothing wrong with your culture, but it's just something for sort of the back of the house. That's your internal conversation. Okay. You don't have Chinese characters in every chair that you're buying that was made in China. And they're not ashamed of their culture, but they're also not putting it in your face necessarily unless you want it, right? So verbal outsourcing, verbal competition, that's the other half. For those people who aren't good at engineering, well, get good at content. And content is actually as important as engineering nowadays, because every new company, the founding influencer is on par with the founding engineer. Today it's founding engineer and founding influencer building a company. Tomorrow it may be founding influencer and founding engineer building a country. That's this book I have coming out called The Network State. And I'll come back to that. So now the software strategy. Basically, what Indians should pursue, they should just start with what India does best and use that to go into various different areas. I came up with like software plus media, plus money, manufacturing, medicine, Mars, and multilateral institutions. India becomes a media superpower does not mean Bollywood trumps Hollywood. It means new world-class Indian startups in pro-tech media and academia. Okay, so we have proof points. Of course, there is Bollywood. There's Saja, like South Asian Journalists Association in the US. There's like the animation market. So there's proof points that Indians can do world-class stuff, very popular stuff. And the collapse of the US media this is just what happened in the early 2010s, but it's not just an economic collapse. It's a
Newspaper ad. Okay. Newspaper. Interesting.
US media this is just what happened in the early 2010s, but it's not just an economic collapse. It's like a spiritual collapse. It's a reputational collapse. US media is declining as, kind of tech rose. And so the alternative vision that India could put out there is the bright sun to the West black mirror. Why does the West produce all of this dystopian content? It's because these guys in media, their future is worse. American media, their future is worse. Okay? That's why they're making all this Black Mirror stuff. That's why they think the future is worse. But there's an obvious flip, which is with Black Mirror, whenever you watch one of those episodes, the implicit stolen base is that things were fine and these tech guys invented something and the world got worse. That the stolen base is that they're implying that your present life is okay and it's a future that's a dystopia. Bright Sun says, hey, our present life is poverty. Our present life is a dystopia, but our future could be bright. Yeah, we're poor, but we can make it. Yeah, like things are hard today, but we can make it in the future. This is a globally appealing vision. And this, by the way, is what like America used to be for the world. It used to be optimistic. It used to be Top Gun. That's what it used to export, the can-do positive spirit. It's lost that.
Can I just interject for a second? I think the context here that a lot of folks in India may not have is this thing of like attacking tech or this woke culture and all these things came from almost, I would say, overabundance in coastal cities, whether it's San Francisco or New York. And because there was so much abundance, then I guess there was a lot of, once all your needs are satisfied, all your luxuries are satisfied, you kind of just start playing like this inside baseball for the status. And that doesn't transport really well to India because there's actually scarcity around you. If you start talking about like, if you import the woke culture and tech companies in San Francisco into India, it actually, it dislocates really badly because, the other day somebody was taking a tractor to the airport in Bangalore because it rained really heavily and the cars could not travel on the road. So they had to bring a tractor from a farm to transport people to the airport, right?
Yes, you can't talk about Indian privilege.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's we want is Indian accomplishment. And the difference between privilege and accomplishment is this, Brooklyn nepotist has inherited everything, and because they haven't built, they feel guilt. And accomplishment is you've built everything and you feel a real sense of pride. That's a big difference. Bio, India becomes the doctor of the world. So basically with telemedicine, India becomes the doctor of the world. So basically, with telemedicine, medical tourism, generic drug manufacturing, cultural disposition towards cash payment, and the Indian medical diaspora, we can reinvent Western healthcare. India's provided doctors for the world, and it's done apps like Arogi Setu, and it's a large generic medicine industry. So doctors, drugs in the diaspora, Indian physicians, generics, vaccines are... what I mean by this is basically like the pharmaceutical industry, not the specific COVID-19 vaccine, but the generics. Those are actually, I think it's fair to say Indian physicians are world renowned. They're basically everywhere. The economy is remote. Telemedicine is legal. Indian MDs are everywhere. Okay. So tomorrow, India can become the doctor of the world. Everyone anywhere can access Indian doctors and drugs, and the medical diaspora helps route the calls. And that's an outside-in strategy where when I say help route the calls, it's like an Indian doctor in Washington State can use their U.S. license, for example, but have 30 Indians in India as their back office. This is, I think, very powerful because you can have all the automated diagnosis stuff, again, whether it's in India itself or it's in another country, even if it's not legal within the U.S. or within another country, it might be legal as a back office thing. You might be able to structure it in such a way that it's legal, the combination of technology and economics. And healthcare is so difficult to disrupt, but this might be the way we could do it.
So we need doctors in our super team Discord.
Yeah.
Yeah, eventually. That's right. So that's a bio aspect. That's my other life. I should probably, like start doing more bio and genetics, posting. And again, what this is doing is taking stuff that already exists. Indian doctors are globally competitive. Indian generic drugs are globally competitive, and India is good at software. So you put this together and you have doctors and drugs that are prescribed from anywhere, and you drop these telemedicine apps and you route it through the diaspora where you've got Indian doctors in Belgium and you've got them in, Australia, you've got them everywhere, right? Achieve self-sufficiency with robotic autarky. So what do I mean by this? There's a lot of Indians who have done pretty well on robotics, like Gray Orange, Diapers.com. Indian founders have done well in robotics. This is the right way to leapfrog Chinese manufacturing because robotics basically turns a lot of this stuff into software. Erode China's manufacturing advantage with automation and then export robotic autarky to the rest of the world. So that's robotic manufacturing, robotic farming, robotic food service, right? If you think about it from a nation level, the Atmanirbhar Bharat concept, you can focus on robotics to achieve that. But it's more than that. It is also exporting it to the world as the international Indian, the global Indian. And so robotics versus traditional manufacturing. Do not think of it as being grunt work. Think about it as legalizing robotics and driving robotics as much as possible. Next concept, Astro. With ISRO, align the world to reach the stars. So turn India into the launch pad for the world. Okay. The US has this global network of military bases, and China's building this as well, military bases, but also they've got their colonies in Africa. Basically, they've got their ports. India can try to, work to build launch sites. And actually, India is leveling up a lot on space. It's close to SpaceX in terms of launch cost, and it has an equatorial launch pad. It's actually best to launch stuff from near the equator just due to geography. But tomorrow, like Indian investors should take stakes in space startups. Every space startup should launch in India. One of the reasons this list links into the broad strategy is satellite internet enables decentralized protocols. Another reason is you're looking up at the stars while everybody else is fighting with each other. And then Politico, build the next post-war order, right? Not the post-war order of 1945 to 2020, which is crumbling now, but the next post-war order is replace US-controlled multilateral institutions with neutral protocols and nation stacks. Give the world a third option, not the US, which is now falling off, or the Chinese superstate. Not the US, which is now falling off, or the Chinese superstate, but something which is neutral. And so, today, India, of course, it's on the outside looking in. It's not on the UN Security Council, or it's part of the SDR. It's a, special drawing reserve. That's because the US wrote the post-war order. Tomorrow, rather than advocating for India #1 or something like that, I don't think that's realistic, nor even really arguably desirable. Instead, you advocate for something that is neutral, that benefits all parties. Acknowledge your self-interest, but also work on something that benefits the other guy as well. So neither US nor Chinese nor Indian dominance, but this is the new rules-based order, not something where it's like effectively America behind the scenes pulling the strings, not so subtly anymore, but actually something where you can audit the code because it's nation stacks and neutral protocols, right? So this is how we protect genuinely liberal values on a global stage of free speech and, freedom of contract and rule of law and so on. So outro, basically become the bright sun to the West Black Mirror, become the positive vision for global technology, leverage our strengths in software, fill the vacuum of the post-war order. While the West is making this dystopic Black Mirror type stuff, make, the bright sun. With a software strategy, reinvent media, money, manufacturing, medicine, Mars, multilateral institutions. That's, info, crypto, robo, bio, astro, and politico. And win and help win. While the US and China fight, offer a third way, neutral protocols and nation stacks.
Wow. It's left me with a bullish feeling that I didn't know was inside me.
It's rationally bullish. See,
Yeah.
I'm not saying like nuclear weapons existed in the Mahabharata or something like that. Okay?
Exactly. It's not that.
It's not
It
that,
seems,
right?
yeah. And
I
it's,
think
it's
the only thing that holds us back is ideological software programming. As I think, when Sir Balaji was talking about it, I was like, okay, there are two things. One is an ambition ceiling, which is, of course we're not going to be able to do that. Like, how are we going to be a media superpower? I don't know, we're going to be able to produce content that can compete on a global scale. That's not what we do, right? The other is the Indian crab mentality, which is, okay, well, because we come from a context of scarcity, one wins at the other cost of another. And there's a sense that we don't have a civilizational desire to rise like it exists in China. I don't know. What do you think about that?
You want a slingshot mentality rather than a crab in the bucket mentality, or a, like win and help win mentality, even better, right? Where it's your win helps you help me win, and vice versa. Win and help win actually is also the profit maximizing strategy in the long term, because crabs in bucket don't have much in the way of resources, since nobody has any resources, since everybody who's stabbed. Win and help win is how technology of VC and so on works. On the ambition ceiling, I think a good thing to, something that somebody should make, I'm not sure if somebody's done this, is sort of stop motion that shows, or like a time lapse that shows the descent of San Francisco and much of the US, the rise of China, but also actually the rise of Indians, as well as India itself to a lesser extent, but also a real extent, right? Like those are the three most important like mega trends, plus of course the rise of technology. When you see where you were and where you've come and where the convergences are, it calibrates better. Like if the Chinese, they were making plastic stuff, they had the humility and the realism to understand that that's where they were at that point in time, but they also had the ambition to get somewhere else. that realistic ambition is important, and both parts are important, not unrealistic and not passive, but ambitious. And I think the internet also, by the way, provides that, because guess what? Crypto protects property rights. The internet allows you to find other ambitious people and work with them. So you can teleport yourself out of the physical environment. If it is a crabs in the bucket surrounding, if the folks around you aren't ambitious, you know what? Teleport yourself into the Super Team Slack or the Super Team Discord. There you go.
You know, Akshay, I like to look at what's happened to Indian cricket, right? Like, to me, it's such a great example. Okay, cricket predominantly, Australia, England, West Indies for a long time, dominant in the sport, had a big share of voice in the culture of cricket also for a very long time. And then in the 90s, India got liberalized. A lot of people got color televisions. Everything started, spreading. Then in the 2000s is when money entered cricket, right? Like the IPL happened, and all of a sudden, way more cricketers were making way more money. It became such a viable way of living. The pie got bigger, right? Now today, we have a different cricket team for every format, each of which is completely dominating what they're doing. We have the number one test team, the number one ODI team, the number one T20 team. It's insane. It's because when math reaches that economy, it's inevitable. When enough people can make money, enough people compete, and enough people get so good that they dominate globally. So I like to look at that as hey, it's possible with the right incentives, and people align themselves around, and the crab mentality no longer applies when not every crab is going to die, right? If you think that there's going to be it's going to be fine inside, you stop pulling people down. It's already happened in cricket, and I don't see why it can't happen otherwise.
Well, the thing is, it's funny because, again, as not as close to it as you folks are, but it feels to me the crab in the bucket mentality is less in India today and much more in America today than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Especially in SF,
I agree.
right?
Especially in SF, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, basically, the U.S. is just, because it feels like this global empire is gravitationally collapsing, people are getting more and more. And then the crab in the bucket mentality accelerates a collapse, so it's a negative feedback loop. I mean, one way of thinking about it is, and this may be one of the things we should probably generate as content, people fundamentally don't understand that wealth can be created, or not, rather, many people don't understand this. And my number one example of this is, where do we steal all the iPhones from? If it's a zero-sum game, right? Where did Steve Jobs loot the iPhones from? Right? And so that shows that wealth can be created. Even more, if you've ever written a program on a computer, think about a piece of desktop software, okay? You can write that on your laptop, you can set up a website, and then people will pay you money for that. What are you actually doing there? What you just did, with no natural resources, just hitting keys, is you created a pleasing configuration of electrons. Okay, it's like an ice sculpture of zeros and ones that you could hit, enter and clone it on everybody's computer.
That's the most beautiful phrasing I've ever seen.
Ice sculpture of zeros and ones.
Yeah. Okay, right. So really, at a very fundamental level, what you did was you created order from disorder, right? You created a better configuration rather than the anarchy of random zeros and ones. You created a useful one. And then what the internet allows you to do is export that order to millions of computers around the world that could just click and pay you for this. So once you think about that, wealth creation is actually about that technological, creation of order of a useful, for example, the difference between a bunch of bricks lying on the ground in a house, right? The difference between a bunch of pieces of wood lying on the ground in a chair, that you can see in physical space. What people confuse in physical space are like, well, you must have gotten the bricks from somebody, you must have gotten the wood from somebody, right? The value add, though, is the ordering of that. And that's more obvious on the computer because it's pure. It's just the electrons, right? Nobody says that you took that from somebody else. And in fact, often the cost of raw materials, not always, but in many things, the cost of raw materials is not anywhere near assembly process and the know-how and the machines and so on to put that together, right? Are you familiar with the Marxist labor theory of value?
Not me.
Well, the basic idea is, there's different ways of doing it. The most popularized version is that the more work is put into something in terms of labor, the more valuable it should be. For example, in the US, there's something called RVU, relative value units. And this is used for actually pricing lots of US medical stuff. And basically, they price it based on the number of labor hours that went into it. If it takes 5 hours of a surgeon to do this, it's really expensive. But if it doesn't, then it's cheaper, right? RVUs, okay? Now, that seems reasonable, except the thing is that people pay or want to pay for the value provided to them.
Correct. Impact. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Not the cost to you, right?
Yeah.
And so there's different ways of thinking about that. It's something where it might take a lot of time to go and handcraft a chair, but an assembly line manufactured one may be cheaper and better. So even the first one might have more labor going into it. The second one is less. It's actually got higher quality, right? And so rather than the labor theory of value, what I think about is the technology theory of value, since the actual value injection is the technology. That's the refrigerator, that is the automobile, that is the light bulb. Rather than having humans running around with candles, holding them and running around with you, right? That put in a lot of labor. It's a technology theory of value that's actually where the value creation is happening. And the place where we can see that is on the computer, where basically everything. So I just mentioned, that when you go and program this piece of software, that's like exporting this ice sculpture of electrons, this pleasing configured electrons everywhere. And I also mentioned earlier, we were talking about printing and generalizing the concept of printing from printing out a piece of paper to printing out like a bowl of food, right? And so once you realize that everything that we can think of will basically just be reduced to software, and that all of the non-software components are gradually going to get commodified. On the other side of that, we're going to robotify a lot of things, because, if humans can't go and unload boxes because of COVID, we're going to, have a fully robotic port, right? If humans can't drive trucks because of COVID, we're going to have self-driving trucks. Accelerating robotics means more and more and more value is created on the computer. And we don't really fully realize this because, right now people are like, they only see the actuation on the phone. You're only seeing things flipping on the screen. But once that's like an arm moving in the physical world, a lot of stuff becomes real. Like the leverage on software is only going to increase. And this is also where the value creation is all going to come from. It's basically the program that creates a value. Everything else is just printing it out. If you think about it, your HP printer is not going to write your book for you. You have to do that. And then hitting enter, it's just a few cents to go and print it out. But the book itself is worth whatever, hundreds of thousands or millions, maybe.
Oh man, this is okay. So there's a few takeaways from this. One is there is a path for India to become a superpower. So I guess we've got to start a way to attract memers, video memers. Anybody out there listening right now, if you're making international grade content, whether you're writing, whether you're a memer, whether you're a videographer, whether you're an animator, send us your proof of work. We'll link to the form below. And we'd love to invite you to our Discord, where a lot of founders of projects hang out, and there's going to be scope to do productive work. You may have the opportunity to work with those founders directly.
Let me give some focus on that, by the way. So what should the content be around? Okay. I think it should be stuff that is around some emerging technology. Drones, robotics, 3D printing, some of the quantified self stuff. There's all of this that's out there that frankly isn't really covered that well because, and this is actually an important thing and an angle on it, the way that Western media covers it, they keep talking about the tech industry. And what they can do is they can cover funding rounds. Why do they cover funding rounds? Because they can't cover the math. They can't cover the science, right? They can't assess it from that angle. And so because of that, they reduce it to money and personalities. But there's a lot of Indians who have also quantitative or engineering backgrounds and or are genuinely curious about the product. So even if you can't do math, you can at least understand the product. Like you guys understand how DAOs work and so on. You can understand it from a functionality, from a product manager perspective. A different kind of business perspective than how much money is made is how does this impact things, right? So that kind of content I think is very valuable because it's exactly what the West is not able to do, since it's just like, almost a dumping ground for press releases and hit pieces, Whereas the substantive stuff is stuff that teaches you something.
Memes that make you laugh are cool, but memes that teach are way more valuable.
Yeah, you can do both, of course. Some of the funniest stuff out there. The American Chopper meme?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's good about that actually is it's actually one of the few that actually is argument and counter argument and so on.
Yeah.
Right. And because it's an amusing context, people can argue about like the Peloponnesian War or something like that in there, right? And present point and counterpoint, right? And you learn something from it because you learn the vocabulary of how a specialist often in the area sees it, right? Anyway.
Let's just keep it simple, right? You saw the podcast that we did today. Make some content around it that explains the ideas that we spoke about today in a more educative, fun way. And the best ones, make it into the Discord. Let's keep that simple.
And I think in particular, if you've got better versions of some of the images in the slides or nice versions of that, a good feed inspiration, the visualize value feed.
Jack Butcher, so good.
By Jack Butcher, exactly. Yeah. That's you don't need to copy that, but just as inspiration. Those are kind of like pro tech visuals.
Yeah. Actually, that would be super useful, right? In fact, if we get some great entries, we're going to link them in the comments because a lot of you might not have 90 minutes to go through the whole podcast, but you get a beautiful summary in different ways. So let's dig deeper into the ideas you heard today and let's turn them into content that can make these ideas more accessible to people. That's the task for today. Thank you, Balaji. This was amazing. This will deserve a second and third hearing just for me and Akshay. So we can prepare for upcoming podcasts. Hopefully we can ask you for your time once again and do us proud in the comment section, please. See you on the next episode.
Thank you, Balaji.
Oh, okay. I think I gained like 15 to 20 IQ points just by listening to this. I have a lot of notes and I think I'm still like missing out on a few major points. So I'll run through them. Also look at like the links that they have mentioned in their description. Hopefully we'll tweet this out soon. Go follow me on Twitter. Everything is in the link below. This has been going on for an hour 40 minutes, so I will end the stream here, but this was great. Thank you for tuning in and see you in the next one.